Hi everyone, welcome to this fantastic session at the Bad Sydney Crime Writers Festival. My name is Nicholas Stewart and I'm the facilitator of today's panel. I first of all want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. I pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded. Today's panel comprises Australia's leading advocates for truth and justice for the LGBTIQ community. To my immediate right is Duncan McNab, a prolific non-fiction crime writer and commentator on Sydney's dark history of criminal identities and the targeted murder of gay men and transgender people. Duncan featured in the SBS documentary Deep Water and the Disney documentary about the killing of Scott Johnson, Never Let Him Go. In the middle is Magistrate Jacqueline Milledge. She's a magistrate of the local court of New South Wales and a former deputy state coroner. Her honour was the coroner who presided over Operation Taradale, an investigation into the death of John Russell and the disappearances and suspected deaths of Ross Warren and Gilles Martinet. And at the far right is Michael Burge, a journalist, author and artist whose debut novel, Tank Water, is a coming-of-age crime thriller set in the bush. Michael co-manages the Maker's Shed, a creative hub in Glen Innes. He's the director of High Country Books, a graduate of NIDA, and Michael was touring coordinator for Arts Northwest. I am a partner at Dalton Turco Lawyers, an LGBT law firm, and the vice president of Australian Lawyers for Human Rights. I worked closely with Duncan and many others to bring about the Special Commission of Inquiry into LGBT hate crimes, which is currently in its final sessions in New South Wales. Jacqueline, if I could start with you.
Yes.
In 2005, you made findings as Deputy State Coroner following Operation Taradale. That was arguably a very significant pursuit of truth and justice for the LGBT community. Can you tell us a bit about Taradale?
Well, Taradale took a long time to get going. We've had a problem with gay hate crime for years and years, decades, and nothing was done about it. And Kay Warren, a mother who had lost her son, kept writing to the police asking if she could get some closure because she wanted to settle her son's estate. And I think she was onto her 10th letter writing to the police asking them to help her. And Steve Page had come across the letter, had read it and felt for her cause and was looking at other like occurrences, and then got permission, and of course there are other police involved earlier, but it was really Steve Page, Detective Page, who got Taradale, pulled it all together and presented a brief to the coroner, and then I became involved then. It's interesting because we were going back in Taradale to about 1985, and we finished the inquest in 2005. So that's a lot of years for something positive to come out of something that was just so terrible. But so Stephen Page was the detective who got it all together, came to the coroner's court. Do you think there's any possibility that we can have an inquest and look into all of these deaths? I grabbed it with both hands and then we ran with it. But you've only got to read Duncan's book to understand that the attitude that the police had at the time and how they weren't interested in gay hate crime because, you know, anyone that was a victim in that situation was not an innocent victim. So they triaged them out of the system and they did nothing about it. Any investigations was very tertiary, if that's the right word, or, you know, there was no depth to it. So the culture just didn't support that's happening. So that's why it took so long. But when it got going, it was a really intense investigation. You know, there were phone calls being listened to. There was a lot of intel that had to be gathered. There was just such a lot to be done with the investigation. That's why it took such a long time at the end, but it took decades before it began.
Can you tell us a bit about the people who were victims who the inquest looked at in Taradale?
Well, even though there were a lot more victims, we only had three victims that we looked at. Mr. Russell, Mr. Maytaney and Mr. Warren. And Mr. Warren's body was missing, Mr. Russell's body was discovered, and Mr. Maytaney, we didn't know what happened with him. But in looking at those three significant victims, we had to look at other incidents of gay hate crime at the time as well. So whilst we focused on those three, and I gave findings in relation to their deaths, there were other victims that we also considered, so that we could get some idea of a pattern and the type of people behind the criminality.
And has anyone been identified as persons of interest in relation to those deaths?
Well, not really, is it? Unfortunately not. No, not Steve Johnson's situation with his brother Scott, that's very, very different. But with Mr. Maytaney, I couldn't be satisfied that he had met his fate the same as the other two, because the people that we were interested, the persons of interest around that time would have been little kids. They wouldn't have been old enough to have been involved in his disappearance. But with the other two, no, we didn't. We haven't even come close to it. Well, we may have come close. With the coroner's court, before you can refer it on to the Director of Public Prosecutions, you've got to be satisfied that there's sufficient evidence that someone could be sent to trial over the matter. And we just didn't get to that standard of proof. But we have a fair idea who was involved. But I can't say anything, because maybe one day something will happen.
Duncan, what are the factors that may have contributed to a culture where the LGBT community became targets for murder and assault in Australia?
History and a cavalcade of problems in the mid-80s, I think, more than anything else. History, very short history. We had New South Wales Police Force weren't traditionally terribly open-minded about a whole range of things, and gay men was specific. Lesbians, they didn't actually acknowledge really existed for that much. It was sort of, the legislation was very clear about who could do what with whom, but gay women had no such, the legislation didn't quite cover them. Gay men were in terrible strife, good for 14 years at one stage, and behind bars if they were caught in some instances. I think the great problem where it coalesced was we had a commissioner in New South Wales called Colin John Delaney, who was, apart from being a crook and a complete mongrel, decided that
Yes.
Gay men were the greatest threat to Australia and his security. And this is curious, because this is in the middle of the McCarthy period in the US. Menzies talking about the yellow peril and reds under the bed, which we read as kids. We're at the time of the Petrov affair in Melbourne, all that sort of thing. We're terribly, terribly, terribly concerned about the domino theory, the communism sort of starting in Moscow and clattering down with the domino finally gets to Canberra. But Colin Delaney didn't think that was so much of an issue, but if you're a gay man, you're in terrible, terrible strife. So he directed his police force, and he'd been in the Vice Squad for years as well, so I think he had a number of interesting quirks himself. The coppers really put a lot of focus on men, and that culture permeated for generations after, I think, and we're only seeing the tail end of it 20, 30 years ago. So Delaney's unpleasantness flavoured the police force and how they behaved, you know, running around toilets trying to lock people up, brutal assaults on gay men just dismissed as, well, you know, you chose your lifestyle, we'll live with it, that sort of thing. That culture was still hanging around in the late 70s, early 80s. Not quite as bad, because we'd been through the 60s, so people were actually starting to broaden their aspects. So by the 70s, 80s, this stink was still hanging around, particularly in upper echelons of policing. So that's hanging around as a very nasty stage. And then in the 80s, the period Jackie's talking about particularly, we've got the confluence of such things. We've got the arrival of gay rights in the late 60s, early 70s, which has currently put it up in the public eye. We've got the Mardi Gras, first Mardi Gras 1978, front page for days, and the New South Wales police actions in that were reprehensible. That's on the front page as well. Then we slip into the 80s and we've got the arrival of the AIDS crisis, 81, 82. All of a sudden that's on the front page. The very compelling advertisement that no one will ever forget, the Grim Reaper commercial, where you've got a Grim Reaper bowling people down merrily. It had an impact on how we thought about how we behave, but it also had this terrible fear complex for people. And gangs of youths, which are presumably the people that were responsible for these attacks, particularly around Bondi, we knew about them. And this gave them a focus. I mean, they always look for a vulnerable target. And if you happen to be loitering around Marks Park late at night looking to meet somebody, or in a lavatory somewhere, you're a very vulnerable target. I think the other problem too is that the gangs, these marauding gangs around Sydney, also had a fair idea that unless they were really unlucky, the coppers weren't going to pay much attention to them. So, and as I use the term very clearly, it's almost perceived as being a victimless crime. You were there, bad luck, mate. And that's presumably, I think, what these things coalesced. And we also have a special mention to certain members of the New South Wales Parliament at the time who reckoned that every gay man was in fact a pedophile, and they had lists which they'd really read under parliamentary privilege. So you had the shrews, for want of a better term, in Macquarie Street, revving things up as well. And this entire thing hits in that one period. And it's an absolute A-grade disaster area. And this is the confluence. It's curious that years later, when we smartened up, liberalised and all that sort of jazz, by the mid-90s, these gangs of youth were going somewhere else. They had other targets. So I think gay men just presented an opportunity for them over this incredibly awful period.
Can I say something too? But also too, that the gay men, they wouldn't come forward and report it because many had other lives, and even those that didn't, you'd weigh up. It's like a woman who was raped. You weigh up what's going to happen. What's the likely outcome of me reporting it? Is it going to do any good? And with gay men, they knew that they were going to be dismissed anyway. But if they weren't, the police. Well, you've only got to see that some police expose people's lives, their secret lives, to the.
Actually, it's the point. It comes back to something I started when writing about it. But the thing that I could never get out of my head, 1981. You're a very young detective.
Not so young.
Thank you very
Not
much.
so young.
Thank you. I was a child. We're called out one morning to the surf club at Collaroy. Anyone, Northern Beaches, Collaroy, nice big car park, surf club, showers and all that sort of jazz, onto the beach, Australian Idle time. We're called there by the uniform coppers who had got out in the middle of the night. They'd gone there, they'd found a bloke in his mid-50s, horribly beaten, absolutely appallingly beaten. They thought he was going to die. And the coppers did the right thing. They called forensics, they called us out and all that sort of stuff. The gentleman was taken up first to Mona Vale Hospital. He was assessed as being in peril of dying, so he's up to Royal North Shore. A couple of days later, when we go to the crime scene, when the light comes up that morning, and we actually find his eyebrow intact in the urinal, and where they tried to kick his head into the hole. And I'll never forget it because the forensic bloke with a pair of tweezers just takes this out. And that's the violence of this assault. But it got really interesting after that. So we think we're dealing with a murder, and we go through the motions quite quickly. And the bloke I was working with was just a decent fella. And he thought, it's where the police you admire, they do the job professionally to the best of their ability, irrespective of who the person is. Rare, not rare, but on some occasions hopeful, but never found. Yeah, at the time it was a little quirky. Yeah. A couple of days later, we find out the bloke's recovering. He actually has regained consciousness. He's talking, he's lucid, he's going to recover quite nicely. So my mate and I go up to see him at Royal North Shore Hospital. We've done some research. We find out he's a reasonably mid-ranking bureaucrat with the ATO. So we're going to be very nice to him particularly. And he lives alone in Lane Cove in that sort of cluster of things off the Pacific Highway. There's lots of 60s horrible units there. And he lives there very quietly on his own. He's got a sister who doesn't know much about anything. She lives down the road. We go to see him. He was more terrified of us than he was of what had happened to him. Yeah, and he completely blanked. He said, I don't remember anything. I don't know anything. I don't want to go on with it. And just the look.
That's terrible, but it's not unheard of, unfortunately.
And never forget the look on his face. And his sister, didn't know about his life. And he was incredibly discreet, apart from Sydney's gay community. And there's a terrific fellow who helped us enormously get the Special Commission up, instrumental in all this, Peter Rolfe, who helps victims of crime everywhere. Wonderful. And I was chatting to Peter about it a couple of years ago, and I described it, and he said, oh God, I know him. So it was also this very closed, small group of people. They all knew each other, but outside that group, they were frightened to tell anybody. And that's what this poor old fellow from the tax office was like. And I'll never forget the look on his face when we walked in. And then he just clammed up completely, just didn't want to know. So we literally couldn't go anywhere with it.
And that's why those thugs are emboldened, because they're never held to account. And they get away with it, they boast, then they add to their group and off they go again. Can I just say something about police and gay men and all of that? And of course you couldn't be gay and be a cop either. You know, that was a no-no.
It was tricky.
Yes, well, not at the very beginning anyway, darling. But you could be a lesbian because, you know, we weren't allowed to marry, we weren't allowed to have children. So of course it did attract a lot of gay women, and we, you know, we seem to accept lesbians, but we wouldn't accept homosexual men, which was really strange. So there were problems inside the ranks with their own people, and also how they police the community.
Michael, I think that would probably lead to your tale about the bush and the culture and the framework that members of the LGBT community find themselves in regional cities and towns. What do you think you've learnt from your research into your latest book? What has that taught you about society in the bush and how it might exclude LGBT people?
Yeah, that's a great question. By the time I came to research and report and to write about gay hate crime, a huge multi-generational body of work and justice to a degree and investigation had happened. But most of that was east of the Great Dividing Range. The tyranny of distance meant that there were some cases that were known about or suspected cases of gay hate crime in the bush. The parliamentary inquiry, you might remember a few years ago, they tried to do hearings in the bush, but it never came about because nobody came forward. But I knew that there were cases because I did some research, and it was Steve Thompson's research. Some papers that he wrote in the 1990s were very explicit about cases of gay hate crime in the region where I came from. Some of them closer to the metro area, but this phenomenon of gay hate crime in Newcastle, Sydney, Wollongong is so widely known. It should be widely known because it's an horrific history. It's a stain on the city's history. But there were gay hate crimes in the bush, and they did take some digging out. By the time I came to it, I almost thought, do I dare write a novel about this? It almost feels like it doesn't exist, so I had to do footwork to find it. The setting of it you're asking me about, well, it's tougher out there. This is the place where this wave of mostly gay men came from. Gary Wotherspoon's work researched this wave of gay men escaping from the country in this period that Duncan was talking about, the sort of height of the fears. We all congregated here. I was born there and came to the city right at that pivotal years, 88, 89, when men were disappearing off the cliffs, unfortunately also disappearing into the AIDS wards. Everyone was whispering about it. There was not much shouting about it. There were those front page splashes, but for a young closeted kid from the bush, it was incredibly confusing. So that setting for me was palpable. It was going back into my past. And then lo and behold, almost the first day that I researched it, I found the case of Russell Payne in Inverell, which is the town where I was born. So of course my eye was drawn to it. And there was very little investigation done. I had to do footwork. It was like I took to journalism I suppose its reporting form at about the age of 40. So I never was a cadet journo when I was young, when you were always out doing the death knocks. But lo and behold, there I was in mature age doing death knock for the family of Russell Payne, and my sister Jenny came with me. Do you remember? Out to Bingara to meet Russell Payne's family. I did the oldest trick in the book to find them. I rang up the Bingara post office and I said, "Do you know the Payne family?" "Oh yeah, they're down the road." I'm not allowed to tell you where they live, but I'll go down and tell them and give them your phone number. So we found them really easily, whereas the police in Inverell seemed totally incapable of finding these people, and it was just 40 k's away. So I was doing these death knocks, and it really was like that. This family in utter confusion about what happened to their son. And in the middle of that was this germ of truth that they remember, yes, that Russell came out to his father-in-law not long before he died. He died in very gruesome circumstances. We still don't know if it was a gay hate crime because there are barriers to finding that out that come from police incompetence, from lack of archiving. It's likely that we'll never know for sure. But I didn't even realise that I was participating in what became the Special Commission of Inquiry then, because then I took that evidence that I found, the witnesses that I found, and handed them over to the Commission. And the next thing I know, I was making a statement, just becoming part of that ongoing story, and with great disbelief that still after all these decades, we're still so in the dark. But the Bush stories, I think technically the two cold cases from the Bush, Graham Painter in Tathra, the far south coast, a cliff fall with unusual clothing, like pants around his ankle, jumper over his head. His family had not been spoken to. They had no idea that their beloved uncle, brother, son was on that list of 88 men. They had no idea that his case was reviewed by Operation Parabel. No idea. But they had a great mystery around his death. And it was very touching, I think because of the passage of time. In both those families, in Russell Payne's case, it turned out that he had come out, although his sister was fairly shocked about the possibility of him being same-sex attracted, but not opposed to the idea. But she's having her response in real time, like it was 30 years ago. Graham Painter's family, again, had a similar reaction, but still these mysteries hanging over that death. So they're not sure whether he was from the queer community or not. Again, not opposed to the idea, because time had passed enough for it to not be unusual. Again, we will never know. The review, the forensic pathologist's review of the Graham Painter case in particular, could still not distinguish between the possibility of an accident, a fall, or a push. So his case is kind of locked in history, but certainly took place in what you call regional, rural Australia. And many times I just felt, gosh, it's like a bit of a Badlands out there.
What is it about the bush that makes it so different to the city when it comes to the LGBT community, do you think?
I think it's visibility mainly. Interviewing politicians, particularly, and families from the bush, there's common elements about this idea that if people are same-sex attracted, or they're trans or queer, on the queer spectrum in some way, that they need to hide it. But it's changing very, very rapidly. In the wake of marriage equality, I think, and some legislation equalising, I think culturally it's changing very fast. I had one politician, Shane Mallard, in his opinion, he believed that, I guess, about the age when, say, I was a teenager, it was unsafe to be out. Now it's changed. It's actually safer to be out because families, neighbours, friends, school teachers will look out for queer kids. And I thought that's a real tipping point. I'm so pleased I lived to see that. And certainly now I live back in the bush. I moved to the city, studied, went overseas, lived in the city for many, many years. Me and my husband moved back to the country in 2017. He's also from the country, Richard. We don't have to do anything other than just be who we are, and it's like a revolution in the country every day, this rapid change of acceptance. It's not all a bed of roses, but not all that's to do with being queer either. So it's very heartening. I feel grateful to have lived to seen it.
Jacqueline, over the last 5 years, we've seen some very high-profile cold case prosecutions, including the prosecution of Scott White for the killing of Scott Johnson, and the recent conviction of Stanley Bruce Early for the killing of Raymond Keane. Why do you think it took so long to identify these perpetrators?
Because nobody told us who they were. The thing with, if I can just use the Scott Johnson matter, when I was at the coroner's court after we had given the inquest findings in Taradale, I was contacted by Dan Glick, who was working for the family, and asked me whether I would review that death. And I got the file out and revived it, and was having a look at it. And that's how I started to be connected to his brother Steve. And of course, whenever Steve came out, we met up, and he used to say, who do you think I could approach next? What do you think I should do? And I would sort of say, well, think about this and think about that and don't think about that and don't push this and don't do that. And one day he said to me, we were out and having a drink, and he said to me, he said, do you think they'll, because he was always hopeful that you know, his brother killer or killers would be identified, would be known. And he said, what's the likelihood of it? And I said, look, I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news. I mean, this is me. I know nothing, really. And I said, it won't happen. I can't imagine it happening, because I can't imagine anyone coming forward and nominating anybody to the degree that we would need, where we could delve into it and have some result. And I said, look, I just, unless somebody tells on somebody, we're never going to know. And of course, look what happened. And it happened, and he got the result that he was hoping for. Certainly didn't bring his brother back, but what we're talking about, at least it gave the family some satisfaction of knowing what happened. And that's the same with all of these matters. It's somebody knows something, and one day somebody will be tired of keeping that secret, and it will be said to someone who will be able to follow through. And so yes, it could take forever. I mean, look at the Dawson case just recently. Look at that after the podcast regenerated interest in that. All those years that had lapsed, and you think, well, that's no good for the preservation of evidence. People's memories aren't going to be revived sufficiently to support a conviction. We're not going to have this, but it does happen. And the thing is that we just don't give up hope. And these people that are involved in these killings, they are monsters, absolute monsters. They've got people that would revere them at one point, and then there'd be a time when there'd be a falling out, and that's what we hope for. And that's why it always takes so long. But we should never give up hope. I regret saying to Steve, I don't think it will, I just can't see it ever happening. And then, of course, he had that wonderful I told you so moment, and I was very, very glad of that. But it can take forever. I did an inquest into a woman, Denise Govinda, who was killed in her home at North Bondi. And they have just recently released a reward for $1 million for, well, I won't say anything about it, but hopefully that might generate some interest in someone sufficiently aware of what went on to come forward and tell us, and then and it's the same with all of these matters. It's just a matter of time. But I support the $1 million reward schemes. I've got to tell you that,
because
absolutely.
That's what led to Scott White being identified, was it, or not?
That was the second step. That's the chronology is actually quite intriguing. They'd got the information beforehand. I know the police. The police are the worst rumour mill in the world, and they started saying, "Oh, it's only because of the $1 million." The reality is actually, hell hath no fury like a family law matter. And there are a couple of cases of gay hate, and a couple of the old ones too, oh God, way back, that they actually cleaned up. It's because the bloke has made disclosures to his wife during the course of their very unhappy marriage. The marriage turns toxic. They have a highly disputed family law matter, and in two cases, and Scott White is one of them, the wife has finally said, well, enough of this. I remember when he said that to me, and they go along to the cops and they say that, and the cops do what cops should be doing, and they then start walking through the evidence. Could it have happened? Blah, blah, blah.
They only need a handle.
Yep.
They just need a handle.
And that's why publicity and the $1 million rewards particularly, and the Special Commission of Inquiry and what led to it, are so important, because it puts these stories back in the public mind. And you might think, 20, 30 years later, you think, geez, I forgot about that. Or that bastard, I'll fix them up. And the whole range of things. But that's that one little, for a detective, just that one little skerrick of information might suddenly start opening doors because the evidence is there. The domino theory for the right reasons.
Yeah, absolutely.
Duncan, can you tell us a bit about Raymond Keem? Who was Raymond Keem? When did he die? How did he die? And what has happened recently?
Raymond Keem's, it was one of the curious cases around, and it's about, late 80s from memory. He was separated from his wife. He had a wife and a couple of kids from memory. He was living not far from Randwick, cross country, easy drive. And he was not a particularly outgoing man, but he used to use beats on occasions. And the Randwick park, not far from the police station. There's always that dreadful rumour that the cops also got a bit of recreation over there as well. He went there one night and he encountered Stanley Early, this dreadful creature, and he was just battered to death. Now, this is a bloke too who was, I think he had been in the army for quite some time. He was very good at self-defence. He knew how to handle himself. So he's not the average bloke who, like me, you sort of walk around and wouldn't have a clue what to do apart from yell or try and call on your mobile phone. Or in the old days, possibly just throw the gun at them rather than try and shoot them because it was a shithouse shot. But this bloke actually was alert, he was trained, but he was overwhelmed by a gang of people, and of which Stanley Early would appear to be the ringleader. And I think I remember when I was researching him back well before he was charged, the circumstances were that it appeared to be a sort of a ringleader. And gangs always have a leader, and the young blokes look up to him, they want their acceptance and all that sort of stuff, which is part of this gang mentality, the grooming mentality of a gang leader. And Early was a leader of this, and basically they just beat this poor bugger to death, literally within a couple of 100 metres from the Randwick police station. And the investigation appears to have been lacklustre, would be put it politely, I suppose.
That's the word I would use.
Yeah, it wasn't as outrageous as the ones you looked at, the Ross Warren thing, which just...
It's dreadful.
and curiously enough, the detective who investigated Ross Warren, who was superbly criticised, turned up a couple of months later in another crime in Oxford Street, the murder of Ludwig Gertsch, which is one of my more...
That's right, it did too. You're quite right.
Same detective, literally, not because he would like these sort of things, it's because of geography. And this was a famous murder which is still unsolved in Oxford Street.
Yes.
And he had started investigating that and completely and utterly stuffed it up. He didn't even go to what was probably the crime scene. And he left, his legacy in this case was a completely screwed up murder investigation with suspects galore. Same fella. So it was the luck of the draw. In Raymond Keane's case, it was just a very mediocre, whatever. Go through the basics. Not unlike Jackie also looked into the John Russell case. If you want mediocrity, breathtakingly mediocrity, and they lose the exhibit.
Yeah, exactly.
And what was it about this man, Stanley Bruce Early, that led him to come to the attention of police and eventually be sentenced?
I'm not sure of the nuts and bolts how he got there, but he became a suspect a couple of years ago. And I know Stephen Thompson, who we were talking about earlier, had also spoken to police sometime in the recent past, discussing potential suspects. I mean, it's a matter of collecting years and years of intelligence, and you look at your suspects based on intelligence, and you either move them up the list or take them off the list. And Stanley Bruce Early, the recent police investigation, which is a very high standard, like the Scott White investigation, these guys are just doing fantastic work. And they've done what is often missed, and we see the police are reviewing the case. Well, what a useless thing. Complete waste of time. They go back to basics. When you get a stuffed up investigation or a cold case that's baffling you, you go back to the very beginning and you look at what the police did then, what they didn't do, what they could have done, what they should have done, contemporary forensics, blah, 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 and you take it back from the absolute start. And that's what these guys have done in Raymond Keane's case. These are what the guys did in the Scott White case as well. And they put the case together methodically, as good detectives should, and they get a result. And the result is that in 2 instances, murderers are finally behind bars after a hiatus of about 35 years. But again, it's not because you review the cases, it's because you go back with an open mind and you start again.
Michael, you previously covered the murder of Gerald Cuthbert in Paddington in 1981. What has come out of the Special Commission of Inquiry in relation to Mr. Cuthbert?
If you forgive me, Gerald Cuthbert was, his case was one of many that I had to touch on in covering other cases. My purview is for the Guardian Rural Network. I recommend, if you've got friends in the country, get them to find us out on Facebook, just a short plug. So Gerald's case was one that I am not fully across, but if I could give you a little bit of a scoop about a story coming out tomorrow in The Guardian about another gentleman who unfortunately was killed at around about the same time. His name was John Gordon Hughes, and the story that I covered about Gerald led to, as it so often does, people contacting journalists to tell us more information. So I'm sorry that I have to change the subject of your question, please forgive me. But John Gordon Hughes, we found out from contact from his cousin, Gordon Hughes, that he was an assisted child migrant to the Fairbridge Foundation in Western Australia during the 1950s. How he ended up getting to Sydney and unfortunately ended up being murdered, strangled in his home in Potts Point, not far from here, is a little bit of a mystery. But what I've become passionate about before writing Tank Water and now in reporting is making sure that these men and some women do not just end up being these names on a list. We know about so much more now because of the Special Commission of Inquiry. It's the first time we've really been able to see photographs of some of these people, to learn about their hopes, their careers, their ambitions, their partners, their families. So they are fully fleshed out, and it has been, for me personally, a real honour to do that in fiction, but also in journalism. And I think it's an important part of the story because it's really the future, I think, of these cases. It lies in continuing to make them three-dimensional. Because I think in many cases, I can understand why you were so pessimistic with Steve, because we all feel that. We feel keenly the barriers to finding any kind of justice, but it was amazing what happened in that case, so we can't write it off for other cases. But in lieu of that, let's find out more and more. And for men like Gerald, even though I've had to avoid answering about him, I'm terribly sorry, but I have learnt so much about other men and some women on that list. And it's as I said, it's my purview to look at the rural-based cases, and because he came really by way of rural Australia to Sydney, John Gordon Hughes, we have found out a lot about him. There's an amazing photograph of him as a young boy, unfortunately about to face great hardship at the Fairbridge Foundation, and we've spoken to his sister from London and his cousin who lives down the Illawarra. But I encourage you to find that story just for the photograph, the hope and dreams on that young boy's face, beautifully dressed in a park in Wimbledon in the 1950s. Of course, it's tragic what happened to him, but it just fills my heart with joy that he actually had hope in his life. He's not just a name on a list, and we must continue that work, I believe, as much as getting justice for them.
Can I just say something about the list? That's one good thing that's come of all of this. There's actually a list now. When we were doing Taradale, particularly with Ross Warren, for all those years, he hadn't even been reported to the coroner. So for 10 years, he hadn't been reported to the coroner. So that's a real impediment to getting some sort of investigation underway. And there weren't lists. And one of the things we were trying to encourage the missing persons and homicide was to make sure that all these matters, that they knew that they were missing or that there was a suspected homicide, unusual death, to report it to the coroner so that at least it went to the next tier, but it wasn't being done. But at least now, even though we're talking about lists and all the people that are still left unsatisfied as a result of the lists, at least now that there's a list.
Duncan, the Scott Johnson matter is interesting because even though the evidence was building and showing that Scott didn't commit suicide, there seemed to be this culture of denial within the New South Wales Police Force. Can you tell us a bit about why you think that came about?
I think for all the aforementioned reasons, Scott, and we discussed earlier the cultural stuff, the Scott Johnson case was intriguing because it happened in 1988 in Manly. It coalesced for me when I was in North America and I went down to see Steve for the first time, and we sat around with his business partner and his lawyer and we had a natter about it. We went through the case and it reminded me of a lot of things because I was a young copper at Manly, so I knew the area backwards. The first detective who looked at the case and flicked it to the coroner so many years ago, I knew her to be honourable and reasonably capable. But I also thought that you could see where the case had its initial problems. They find a body in unusual circumstances at the bottom of the cliff. A uniformed copper turns up and runs the case. Well, that's unusual. Detectives don't even go up to the scene. and there's never a detective anywhere near it, which I find unusual in those days. The coppers say it wasn't a gay beat. I thought, bullshit. Every copper in Christendom knew about it, so let's push that to one side. Then Steve has an acquaintances in Boston where he's studying at Harvard, and they get Ted Kennedy, who's a local senator, to write. This is what politicians do. That's half their job in life.
Like our local members.
Exactly. And immediately the New South Wales Police said, I could almost see the letter from Kennedy bouncing down to Manly Police Station until I got to the detective. And I can hear, because I knew the bloke who was running it at that stage, and I can hear him saying to the female detective in blank, piss this off, because we just want to get rid of it. And that's what happened. It was wrapped up very neatly. Yeah, obviously, bloke's fallen at the bottom of a cliff, no clothes on, who cares? He was obviously topped himself or had an accident, all over. And it fermented for many years, and it wasn't until Jackie and Steve Page did Taradale that Steve Johnson becomes aware of this wave of crime sweeping through Sydney at the same time. By that stage, and this is always a nasty rumour too that the police pushed around, day one, there was this rich American, the big swinging dick, as I used to unfortunately call him, comes out to Australia and shows off. Well, that's bullshit. Steve Johnson in 1988-89 didn't have a bean to his name. He had a wife. He had a brand spanking new child. He was living...
No money.
Not a bean. But years later, he and his business partner came up with this clever idea that we think we can send a photograph via this thing called the internet. And Steve, consequently, is extremely well-to-do. And he heard about this. He heard about Jackie and Steve Page's work, and he thought, could this have been another one? Pretty good offer, I would suggest. And they start digging and digging and digging. And eventually, it's 3 inquests, remember, wasn't it? That's right. This is just gives you a snapshot of police thinking. They're saying no, no, no. At one point, a copper does say, maybe, but he doesn't get terribly far either. At the day of the final inquest, where Michael Barnes decides and finds that there's all probability of murder, I remember standing outside the courtroom in the foyer of the old coroner's court. I was with Peter Rolfe, Steve Johnson, Steve Page, and a senior member of the New South Wales Police Force, who I'll keep quiet about, I suppose. He comes past, and I thought this is a really great opportunity because there'd been so much bad blood, caused primarily because of the police attitude, and I think one shithouse interview on the ABC. These 3 blokes, Steve Johnson, Steve Page, and Peter Rolfe, go across to speak to the detective. You know, what's the next step going to be? And the detective just looked at them dismissively and said, the coroner got it wrong, and turned and walked away.
Yep.
And I mean, that's this...
Us coroners don't know what we're doing.
No, and I always thought you did, actually.
I got it wrong too, everybody. I'm terribly sorry I got it wrong as well.
Yeah, and this attitude persisted because then we had a number of reviews which were absolutely bloody useless. And it wasn't until a couple of years ago that Mick Fuller, as Commissioner, did something really smart. I think he read the political tea leaves and thought, this is a shit fight that's not going to go away, let's fix it.
He was a decent man.
Yeah, and he got it right. He put a brand spanking new team of detectives on it from a different background as well. So they're looking at it with a very different lens, I suppose. And they went back to basics. They're doing their investigation, and up pops the disgruntled former wife. Manna from heaven, then comes along the $1 million reward, and the thing is really rolling. And the bloke gets locked up, and then he sort of admits to it, then doesn't admit to it, then admits to it finally. They got a result, and I'm with Jackie. I remember sitting down with Steve Johnson, Christmas 2015, I think it was, in Massachusetts.
Oh, sorry, mate.
And I'm looking and saying, well, this is bullshit. The cops have lied to you. They missed all this sort of, going down the checklist of misery. And he said, what do you think the chances of solving it is? And I said, Slim and Buckley's. He said, you're very blunt, aren't you? But at that particular point, the only way we would ever get a crack in that case was to shake it so hard and so often that someone would come forward. In this case, an ex-wife. The member of the public would have been great. Dan Glick's investigation, finding people who'd run into similar problems up at North Head, was really eroding the police confidence in their own decisions as well. They're not going to admit that. The coppers still, to a point, as the Royal Special Commission's finding out, still don't actually want to acknowledge that they stuffed up. Yeah.
Close ranks.
Yeah. Rather than say, yeah, we've stuffed it up, this is why we stuffed it up, well, this is what we're going to do about it, they're still stonewalling. And the Special Commissioners had terrible times getting exhibits, getting statements, getting all the nuts and bolts. The police have been resisting every step of the way. And so that culture hasn't really changed.
And the other thing that the press got hold of the fact that it was the 3rd inquest, 3 inquests for the Johnson matter, unprecedented 3 inquests. Well, it wasn't unprecedented. The first inquest, the coroner was very much guided by the police that this is a suicide, and the coroner's comments and his finding was that because Scott was highly intelligent, and gay, he was a likely candidate of suicide. So he just dismissed it. Because he was highly intelligent and he was gay, he was a likely candidate for suicide. And that's the police attitude, and that sadly it permeated into the next level, which is the coronial jurisdiction. So then after I revived the case, and then it went to another inquest, and Coroner Forbes then opened it up and sent it back to the police to be properly investigated. And then, of course, then Michael Barnes did the ultimate inquest. So, yes, it was three inquests, but the first inquest got it wrong. The second one was to open it up, and the third inquest was to deliver the proper finding.
What do you think we've learnt from the Special Commission of Inquiry? And I want to talk about exhibit management and evidence management. Jackie, you looked at John Russell's killing.
With the hair.
Can we talk about the hair?
He had. He's at the bottom of the cliff, and we knew about Marks Park. We knew that the men that went there to socialise and to meet other men, they would make their presence known because it was dark. It was that's why they went there. It was secluded, and it was very, very private. And they would either jiggle their keys or jiggle their coins. And Scott Mr. Russell's body was down on the rocks at the bottom of the cliff. He was facing the way Alan Carla, the pathologist, believed he was facing the wrong way for someone who had just stumbled and fallen or jumped intentionally himself. But near his body were coins. Now, that should have said something. But importantly, on the back of his hand, resting on his hand, were hairs, quite a clump of hairs, if you've seen the photos, that didn't come from his own scalp. And Alan Carla, who was an absolutely first-class pathologist, said when you look at the hairs, and he could only look at them in a photo because the police had captured the hairs and lost the hairs. And Alan Carla believed that those hairs had come from one of the perpetrators, and that it was just, for some reason, it managed to remain on the back of the victim's hands. But not only did they lose it, no one was held to account for it. The young police officer that lost it, or that took it and lost it, gave evidence in the inquest, and nothing happened to her. Nothing. They didn't revise their systems. Look, this Special Commission of Inquiry, I have every confidence that it's going to come up with some wonderful recommendations that must be followed through, but the police have got to follow through. There's got to be some gravitas behind those recommendations. I would like to think that a lot has changed. I don't have the confidence that it has changed. I really don't, and I'm sorry to say that. I have confidence that it could change, but I'm not so sure that it has, because no one gets held. They're not held accountable for anything that they get wrong.
I was just going to say that's why gay hate crime makes such, hopefully, compelling fiction, because it just seems as though someone made up that story of the police not even keeping that evidence or discounting it and not being held to account. That's like the building tension of a crime novel.
Yeah, and Mr. Warren's keys were found. His keys were found in a ledge
by his friend.
Yeah. And, and anyone that knew the area knew this thing about the jiggling keys and the jiggling coins. And what does that tell you? And you're quite right. If people weren't privy to what actually goes on, you wouldn't believe it. You just wouldn't believe it. So keep writing.
Absolutely. We've got 10 minutes to go, and I thought it might be a good time now to open up to the audience in case anyone has any questions. If you do have a question, we've got a microphone that's roving, and we've also got people, just so you know, watching on the internet. Any questions?
You might not want to answer this, but in your discussion, you talk almost like the police, individual police and police force, not being competent. But, based on what I've seen on the current commission, you know, and the stonewalling that's been going on and not providing information and everything else. It feels to me that nothing has changed. And also, so is it possible those things were lost with intent? And you know what I mean? It's like, can they all be that stupid? Or things got lost because they needed to get lost?
There's a number of answers to that. I think there is still a massive cultural problem in the upper echelons of policing. But we also see the great work has been done to arrest Scott Johnson's killers, Raymond Keane's killers, and I think there have been some great cold cases recently as well. We don't hear much about them, but across the broad spectrum. But I think back in those days, I just think it was just shit police work, frankly. Yeah. And it was a bit of a lottery too. If you got a good detective who did their job professionally... And
there were many. There were many.
Yeah, there's just a quick anecdote. One of the great detectives I encountered throughout inquiries in this was a guy called David Ainsworth, who believed that there'd been a murder of a gay man in Wollongong. He'd chased it for bloody years. His fellow detectives told him to take a hike. Operation Parabel and the remarkable inquiry that was conducted in the lead up to the coronial inquest couldn't even find the coroner's notes. That's how crap their investigation was. It's just because they just fail. Some people do a great job, like David Ainsworth. Steve Page, remarkable job, the best bit of investigation you could see. But others just were lacklustre, unprofessional, disinterested, and some, of course, were at the bottom end of all that, saying, "Hey, who cares? Your problem."
And the closer you get to the region where I come from, and the further back in time you go, the less oversight there was of the investigative work that they did. And so in Graham Painter's case, there was just a set of random notes from a notebook, no reports typed up, names spelt incorrectly, so that by the time reinvestigations and commissions come along, they've got to do all this footwork just to find that paperwork. And as you've seen, obviously you've been watching online or been there in person, there's a myriad of reasons why those things have been delayed, but none of them add up to anything necessarily positive.
And also, in Crispin Dyer's case, a former ACDC manager, it was only as a result of the fantastic team at the Special Commission of Inquiry who sent the deceased clothes off for forensic examination, and when doing that, identified in the top pocket of his shirt a phone number written on a piece of paper, which was never discovered by police. Yeah. It was only discovered as a result of the Special Commission of Inquiry.
Which is a spectacular failing day one.
I did the police's work for them in Inverell, for sure, and on the phone in Tathra and Canberra. I felt I was overstepping the job of a journalist, but I cared more about the result than I did about getting a slap on the wrist from the police.
Can I just say, we are concentrating on gay hate crime, and I don't want anyone to think that these things are lost, overlooked, ignored simply because of the attitude to the victims. Unfortunately, across the board, there's a problem with accountability and making sure, exhibits. For 4 years, I was harassed as a police officer in my home. I had my house pelted with bottles in the middle of the night. They'd yell out, "Fucking police." They poured tar on my house. They poured Duco all over my little white car twice, stomped on it, wrote the words pig. Anyway, lots of other things that they did to me. And for 4 years they did it. And they finally slipped up and they left a can of the paint that they were using to pour all over my car with their fingerprints. They were fantastic. Oh my God, I was so happy.
That's a great idea for a crime novel.
Oh, let me tell you, darling. Anyway, so there they were, gave it to the investigating police officers, lost it. So, that's just my little sad story. So please, I don't want anyone to think that all of these horror stories are simply because of the sexuality of the victim. Unfortunately, when we're looking at accountability, systems, record keeping, all of those, it's got to be a broad brush and it's got to go across the stratosphere. Is that the right word?
Good.
Is that a good word?
Yeah,
would you use that in a novel? Probably not.
There's a lot of syllables in that.
And there's some really good police officers that do good jobs. There really are. Yeah.
Just as a quick, Jackie's absolutely, what the Special Commission I think will do, I'm prefacing things a bit. It not only looked into what happened in gay hate crimes, but it's also exposing this crap evidence handling across the board. And I think I agree with Jackie, it blows out across the lot. And just as a quirky one, the Wanda Beach murders, 11th of January 1965.
Yes.
New South Wales Police got something right. They kept a little slide with the only DNA sample from the murder on it. And they kept it, and they kept it, and they kept it. And a couple of years ago, they went looking for it, but the government laboratory had misfiled it. No one knows where the bloody thing is. And there's a suspect. But I spoke to the copper who was handling the case, who was just tearing his hair out because they'd sent it off to a laboratory some years ago for updated DNA testing. Nothing to see here. And they'd gone back and said, let's have another crack at it because forensics changed so much. We can't find it. So that case, it's the only sliver of forensic evidence left, and it's missing somewhere in a box in a laboratory. But I think...
Might be found.
Yeah, we always have. The Special Commission, I think, has done a fantastic job telling us, they've done things detectives should have done years ago. And they've also exposed how abysmal the evidence handling is. It shouldn't be this bad. Even if there was some human error happens all the time, okay, we live with this. But this is just this systemic stuff up from start to finish. And that, if anything coming out of the Special Commission will be putting the onus on the New South Wales Police Force to pull their fingers out and get it right.
And I always thought we needed a Royal Commission, and when they said they were setting up the Special Commission of Inquiry, I thought, oh, that's not good enough. No, because I know everything. That's not good enough. And then I met Justice Sakar, and I went, wow, this man knows exactly what he's doing, and he and his special team have not let us down.
When Nick and I go back on this for years, getting the upper house committees going, then pushing the commission through, and finally getting it signed off as a commission of inquiry, I think I could reasonably say that we had sensible expectations of what could be achieved. For my two bobs worth, and I'm as cynical as all get out, the Special Commission have just exceeded any expectation I would have had. And it's on the front page because it's been well reported.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to finish. We don't have any more time for further questions, but we'll be around if you want to come and ask questions of us. I just want to thank the panel again for giving up your time. All of your work has led to truth and justice for many families and victims, and it gives me hope. I think it gives the community hope that as humans we can move and progress and make the world a better place for the LGBT community. And can I just say for our First Nations community too.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
I agree with that. Thanks, everybody.